Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're going deep on martial law.
Ooh, interesting.
We got some really fascinating material for this deep dive.
Okay.
A mix of historical accounts, some legal analysis, and even some survivalist perspectives.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to try to get like a well-rounded view of this whole concept.
Okay.
Not just about, understanding what martial law ISS on paper,
Right.
but like how it's actually played out, in history and what it could mean
Right.
for you listening right now.
It's interesting. Martial law, it often gets portrayed as very dramatic,
Oh, yeah.
almost Hollywood-esque.
Carl.
But the reality is much more nuanced
Right.
and frankly kind of unsettling when you start peeling back the layers.
For sure. So let's start with the basics. When we talk about martial law, what exactly are we talking about?
At its core, it's the military taking over civilian government functions.
Okay.
Usually in response to some kind of emergency.
Yeah.
But it's not just about, troops assisting with disaster relief.
Right.
It's like a fundamental shift in
Yeah.
power dynamics.
Now, I've always thought of martial law as like a wartime thing,
Mm-hmm.
but our sources suggest it's not always that clear cut, is it?
Not at all.
No.
We tend to associate it with major conflicts like the Civil War,
Right.
but it's been used in a surprising variety of contexts, from natural disasters
Okay.
to labor strikes,
Wow.
even to combat organized crime.
Organized crime. That's a new one for me.
Yeah.
I'm curious to learn more about that.
Yeah.
But first, let's talk about the legal side of things.
Okay.
Where does martial law fit into the U.S. Constitution?
Well, the Constitution itself doesn't explicitly say the president can just declare martial law
Okay.
nationwide.
Okay.
And there's this thing called the Insurrection Act,
Right.
which gives the president power to deploy troops domestically,
Okay.
but Congress has a say too.
That-
So it's not a simple the president says so and it happens situation.
Okay. So there's already a gray area there.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that whole thing about the suspension clause, right?
Yeah.
Which, from what I understand, means some of our fundamental rights
Right.
could be suspended under martial law.
The suspension clause specifically allows for the suspension of habeas corpus
Cool.
during times of rebellion or invasion.
Okay.
Basically, that means you could be detained without the right to challenge your detention.
Wow. Hold on. So if habeas corpus is suspended,
Yeah.
you're basically at the mercy of the authorities.
Pretty much.
That's pretty alarming.
Yeah.
But what about other rights, like freedom of speech or the right to a fair trial?
Mm-hmm.
Does martial law just wipe those out too?
This is where it gets really complex.
Okay.
While habeas corpus can be suspended,
Okay.
the Constitution explicitly states that other rights are supposed to remain forever inviolable.
Right.
But in reality, the line can get blurred.
Okay. Huh.
It leads to all sorts of legal debates about
Yeah.
how far is too far when it comes to
Right.
restricting liberties during martial law.
So we've got this legal framework that's a bit ambiguous, to say the least.
Yeah.
But how has this actually played out in history?
Yeah.
What can we learn from past examples of martial law, like in action?
Well, there are a few key historical examples that really illuminate the complexities of martial law.
Okay.
Take the Civil War, for instance. Lincoln's decision to declare martial law
Mm-hmm.
sparked intense debate
Yeah.
about whether it was truly necessary to save the Union
Right.
or if it was a dangerous overreach of executive power.
I've always been fascinated by the Civil War period. Didn't that also lead to some important legal precedents
Yes.
regarding martial law? I vaguely remember something about military courts.
You're thinking of the Ex parte Milligan case.
Okay.
Decided in 1866.
Okay.
It established that even during wartime, civilians can't be tried by military courts.
Okay.
If civilian courts are still functioning.
Okay.
It's a landmark ruling
Right.
that emphasizes the importance of checks and balances, even in times of crisis.
Yeah, it's all about preventing one branch of government from having too much power,
Yeah.
even during an emergency.
Yep.
But history also shows us that
Yeah.
things don't always go according to plan, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look at Hawaii during World War II.
Okay.
Martial law lasted for 3 years there,
Wow.
which ultimately led to the Supreme Court case, Duncan v. Kahanamoku, in 1946.
Okay.
That ruling clarified that military courts
Mhm.
couldn't be used to try civilians in peacetime,
Okay.
even if martial law had been declared.
So we have these historical cases that establish some boundaries.
Right?
But it seems like there's still a lot of room for interpretation.
Absolutely.
And that makes me think about more recent events,
Mm-hmm.
like the Detroit riots in 1967, where federal troops were deployed,
Right.
but there was no formal declaration of martial law.
Exactly. That's a perfect illustration of how things can get murky.
Yeah.
You know, it raises the question, when does it cross the line
Right.
from military assistance to actual martial law?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for people caught
Yeah.
in the middle?
Those are some tough questions.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's no easy answer,
Right.
especially when you consider how different situations can call for different responses.
Yeah.
Like one of our sources mentions that martial law was even used in Alabama in 1954
Uh-huh.
to combat organized crime.
Right. It wasn't always about war or rebellion.
Yeah.
The Alabama example shows that martial law could be invoked for
Okay.
a wider range of reasons than
Right.
we might initially assume.
Yeah.
And that's a crucial point for our listeners to consider
Okay.
as we delve deeper into this topic.
Okay. So we've established that martial law is a complex beast with a long and winding history.
Yes.
But let's get down to brass tacks.
Okay.
If martial law were to be declared,
Yeah.
what could that actually mean? Like for you, for your everyday life?
Well, one of the most immediate concerns
Yeah.
would be the potential suspension of civil liberties.
Okay.
Think curfews, travel restrictions, maybe even censorship.
Wow.
You know, things you might take for granted in a free society
Right.
could suddenly be restricted,
So basically life as you know it could change dramatically overnight.
potentially.
That's unsettling to say the least.
Yeah.
What about the legal system?
Okay.
Would people still have the same protections and access to justice
Mhm.
under martial law?
That's another major concern.
Okay.
Military trials could replace civilian courts,
Right.
which operate under very different rules.
Okay.
It could become less about due process
Right.
and more about swift judgment. Okay.
Which would understandably make anyone nervous.
Right. And let's not forget about like the concentration of power.
Mhm.
If the military's in charge,
Yeah.
there's less oversight,
Right.
more potential for abuse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the inherent risks of martial law
Yeah.
is that it places a tremendous amount of power
Right.
in the hands of a single entity.
Okay.
And that always raises concerns about accountability
Yeah.
and whether that power will be used responsibly.
Speaking of real world concerns,
Yeah.
one of our sources is an article called 5 Rights You'll Lose Under Martial Law,
Okay.
which offers like a survivalist perspective
Mhm.
on this whole issue.
It's fascinating to consider this perspective, isn't it?
Yeah.
It acknowledges that there are people out there
Right.
actively preparing for a martial law scenario.
Yeah.
And while we're not here to endorse
Right.
or dismiss any particular viewpoint,
Right.
it's important to understand these perspectives.
And what drives them.
It definitely gives you like a different way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, for sure.
And the comments on the article are all over the map.
Really?
We've got George Orwell, who seems convinced that martial law would lead to total
Oh.
chaos
Okay.
and criminals running rampant.
That's a pretty bleak outlook, isn't it?
Yeah.
It speaks to like a deep-seated fear of societal breakdown
Right.
and the potential for violence to spiral out of control.
Then you've got Tom,
Okay.
who believes civilians could actually defeat the military,
Oh, wow.
citing the American Revolution.
Interesting.
He even claims that Americans own more firearms than the military.
Tom's perspective is interesting because it taps into this idea of resistance
yeah.
against tyranny,
Yeah.
a very American concept.
Yeah.
It's a more optimistic, even defiant view
Right.
of how things could play out,
Right.
which probably appeals to a certain mindset.
Two drastically different reactions.
Yeah.
Both rooted in very real anxieties.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think these comments tell us about how people grapple with like the idea of martial law?
I think it highlights the fact that people respond to uncertainty in vastly different ways.
Right.
Some are driven by fear,
Yeah.
while others find a sense of empowerment or even defiance.
Right.
And these perspectives often reflect
Yeah.
deeper societal anxieties and beliefs
Yep.
about power, authority, and individual rights.
It's a good reminder that even when we're all looking at the same information,
Right.
our interpretations and reactions can be incredibly diverse.
Absolutely.
And that's something to keep in mind as we
Uh,
continue to explore this complex and
Mhm.
often controversial topic.
For sure.
It's fascinating how those comments reflect such contrasting anxieties about martial law.
Yeah.
But this isn't just about abstract fears, right?
Mm.
This 5 Rights article
Yeah.
gets pretty specific about potential real-world impacts.
Yeah.
Like what could actually happen.
Yeah, it paints a stark picture of
Right.
how everyday life could change.
Okay.
They discuss things like door-to-door searches
Wow.
and even firearm confiscation.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They bring up Hurricane Katrina, where there were reports of authorities seizing guns from citizens,
Right.
supposedly for safety reasons.
That raises an interesting point.
Yeah.
I remember that being a huge controversy at the time.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really brings home that tension
Right.
between security and individual rights.
Exactly. There's always debate about how far the government can go in restricting rights, even in extreme situations.
Right.
And the article doesn't shy away from those tough questions.
Okay.
They even suggest private property could be confiscated or repurposed for military use.
Wow, that's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
Can you imagine like the military just taking over your house to store supplies or whatever?
Yeah.
What recourse would people even have if their property rights were violated under martial law?
That's one of the biggest concerns, right?
Yeah.
The article points out that you'd be relying on the military justice system,
Okay.
which operates very differently from civilian courts.
Right.
It makes you question whether the usual legal protections would even apply.
It's like stepping into a whole other legal reality.
Right.
And the article brings up a really disturbing historical parallel.
Okay.
Those Japanese Americans detained during World War II,
Right.
Some had their sentences reduced later,
Yeah.
but they had to go back to civilian courts to seek justice.
Precisely.
Okay.
Under martial law, if civilian courts aren't functioning,
Right.
that avenue for appeal
Yeah.
might not even exist.
Okay. So it's not just about the immediate impact.
Right.
It's the long-term consequences
Exactly.
that are truly worrisome.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about the potential downsides.
Yeah.
But is there ever a situation where martial law might be justified?
Well,
Like, when does it actually make sense?
right.
What does the article say about that?
The article acknowledges there's no easy answer.
Okay.
It really depends on the specific circumstances and your personal goals.
Okay.
But they emphasize that expecting things to go on as normal
Yeah.
is probably unrealistic.
Yeah. I mean, if the military's in control,
Right.
daily life is bound to be disrupted in some way.
Right. And the article points out that enforcement would likely vary
Okay.
depending on factors like population density
Okay.
and proximity to key infrastructure.
Okay.
Their advice:
Yeah.
if you want to avoid trouble, lay low
Okay.
and don't draw attention to yourself.
But they also acknowledge that staying out of sight isn't always feasible,
Right.
especially if martial law makes it hard to survive,
Yeah.
or if you're forcibly relocated or something.
That's where it gets really tough.
Yeah.
They pose some difficult questions. What if your house is taken over?
Right.
What if your supplies are seized?
Mhm.
What if you need to escape a dangerous situation, but there's a travel ban?
Those are some heavy questions.
Yeah.
And I'm noticing they don't really offer any concrete answers.
Yeah.
More like guidelines for navigating a chaotic situation.
Well, they do have this martial law checklist.
Oh,
They
okay.
encourage readers to print out. It's
Yeah.
all about preparedness,
Right.
which speaks to that prepper mentality we discussed earlier.
Right. It's like a whole other way of thinking about
Oh.
risk and resilience.
Yeah.
And speaking of diverse perspectives,
Okay.
we can't forget those reader comments.
Yeah.
We talked about George and Tom's contrasting views,
Mm-hmm.
but there's one from Dina that caught my eye.
Okay.
She claims U.S. Marshals have more authority than any sheriff
Oh.
or police officer.
Okay.
So she's saying,
Hmm.
if they show up,
Yeah.
everyone has to listen to them.
Ah, yes, Dinah's comment. It's important to clarify that while U.S. Marshals do have broad law enforcement powers,
Okay.
their authority usually operates
Right.
within the federal justice system.
Yeah.
It's not a simple hierarchy where they supersede everyone else.
So it's not as clear cut as Dina makes it seem,
Exactly.
especially in a complex situation like martial law,
Yeah.
where different agencies might have
Right.
overlapping jurisdictions.
Exactly.
Mm.
It's always best to consult reliable legal sources
Okay.
for a clear understanding of how these things work
Right.
rather than relying on generalizations.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears a bit,
Okay.
one of our sources pointed out that martial law has been declared at least 68 times
Wow.
throughout U.S. history.
Really?
That's a surprisingly high number.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It challenges the notion that martial law is this
Yeah.
rare, almost mythical occurrence.
Oh,
the
yeah.
reality is it's been a recurring,
Okay.
albeit controversial aspect of American history.
And the reasons for declaring martial law have been all over the map.
Yeah.
There's the Coeur d'Alene labor unrest in Idaho back in 1892, where striking miners were arrested and detained by the National Guard.
That's a prime example of how martial law has often been used to suppress labor movements and quell unrest that threaten powerful economic interests.
It reminds us that martial law isn't always about responding to external threats, but can be a tool for maintaining social control.
Exactly.
Then there's the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, where martial law was declared to try and maintain order after the devastation.
That's a more straightforward case where the need for immediate action might be easier to understand.
Yeah.
But even then, there are always concerns about potential overreach and how long those extraordinary powers should remain in place.
Right. Even in a crisis, the balance of power needs careful consideration.
Absolutely.
Another striking example is the Colorado Coalfield War, where martial law was declared twice.
Oh, wow.
In 1914 and 1917.
That case highlights the complex interplay between state and federal authority during martial law. It also raises concerns about private armies.
Oh, wow.
Like the one owned by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, operating alongside government forces.
Wow, that adds another layer of complexity and potential for conflict.
It seems like martial law can create a very volatile situation, especially when you have multiple actors with different agendas. Precisely, which is why clear legal frameworks and strong oversight mechanisms are so crucial to ensure the use of military force is proportionate, justified, and doesn't lead to human rights violation.
So we've seen how martial law has been used to quell labor unrest, respond to natural disasters, and even target specific groups like the Mormons in Utah back in 1857. It's a pretty diverse set of examples.
Yes.
But is there a common thread that runs through all of these historical cases?
One key takeaway is that the declaration of martial law is often driven by a perception of threat. Whether it's a real and imminent danger or a more perceived threat to the established order.
So it's not always about a clear-cut case of self-defense.
Exactly. And that perception of threat can be shaped by various factors, from political ideologies to economic interests and social anxieties.
So it's kind of subjective?
The subjectivity is where things get tricky. Because it opens the door for potential misuse. Like suppressing dissent or targeting certain groups.
Like we saw with the Mormons in Utah, who were perceived as a threat to federal authority and social norms.
It's a reminder that martial law can be used as a tool to enforce conformity.
That's that's a little scary.
Absolutely. It's a cautionary tale. Especially in today's world, where we see increasing polarization and intolerance. Martial law isn't just an abstract concept. It has the potential to impact real people's lives in profound ways.
It's a stark reminder that even in a democracy, power can be used in ways that erode our freedoms.
For sure.
Okay, so we've discussed the history and some potential impacts, but let's go back to the legal framework for a moment. We mentioned the Insurrection Act earlier. Can you unpack that a bit more for us?
Sure. The Insurrection Act, which actually dates back to the 18th century, gives the president the authority to deploy troops within the U.S. To suppress rebellion or enforce federal law, but only when requested by a state's governor.
So it's not just a free pass for the president to send in the military whenever they want.
No, there are specific conditions that have to be met, and it's supposed to be a last resort when civilian law enforcement can't handle the situation. But there's still a lot of debate about its scope and whether it's been used appropriately throughout history.
Like during the Civil Rights Movement, when federal troops were sent to the South to enforce desegregation.
Yes. That's a key example of the Insurrection Act being used to protect civil rights and uphold federal law against state resistance. But it's also been invoked in more controversial situations, like during the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles.
And more recently, there have been calls to use the Insurrection Act in response to protests and civil unrest, which has sparked a lot of concern about the potential for abuse and the militarization of domestic law enforcement.
It's a very sensitive issue. It highlights the need for careful consideration and clear guidelines when deploying troops within the U.S.
Right.
So while the Insurrection Act is a powerful tool,
it needs to be used with extreme caution.
But what about the president, like, unilaterally declaring martial law?
Okay.
Is that even legally possible?
That's where things get really murky.
Okay.
The Constitution, as we've discussed, doesn't explicitly give the president that power.
Okay.
And the Supreme Court, while they haven't definitively ruled on it, has expressed skepticism about the idea of unlimited executive power.
Right.
Especially when it comes to suspending constitutional rights.
So it's not a clear cut.
Right.
Yes or no.
Exactly. There's ongoing debate among legal scholars about the limits of presidential power in emergencies,
right,
and whether martial law could be justified in extreme circumstances.
Like a massive foreign invasion or a natural disaster that completely cripples the government.
Those are the kinds of scenarios that often get brought up.
Okay.
But even then, there are concerns about due process, separation of powers.
And the potential for abuse.
It's a complex legal issue with no easy answers.
Yeah.
But the very idea of a president declaring martial law is unsettling.
Yeah.
It really underscores the importance of protecting our democratic institutions and the rule of law.
Couldn't agree more. It's not something to take for granted.
Yeah.
We need to be vigilant and informed because the consequences of martial law, whether it's declared legally or not, can have lasting impacts.
Right.
Speaking of which, there are a few more historical examples.
Oh, yeah.
We haven't touched on yet.
Like the West Virginia coal wars in the early 20th century.
Right.
I remember reading about those intense labor conflicts and the violence that ensued.
Right. Martial law was declared multiple times to quell those strikes.
Right.
It's an especially compelling case because it involved both state and federal troops, highlighting the challenges of maintaining civilian control over the military in a politically charged environment.
And it raises questions about whose interests are being protected when martial law is declared. In that case, it seems like the government sided with the mine owners against the workers.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It underscores that concern about martial law being used as a tool to suppress dissent and protect those in power.
And there are other examples that echo this concern.
Yeah.
Like the 1934 truck drivers' strike in Minneapolis.
Right, where martial law was used to break the strike and undermine labor organizing efforts.
Another instance of the military being used to enforce economic interests rather than purely for national security.
Precisely. And then there's the San Francisco waterfront strike, also in 1934. That led to some of the most violent clashes between workers and police in U.S. history.
And ultimately resulted in the National Guard being called in and martial law being declared.
It shows how martial law, while intended to restore order, can sometimes escalate tensions and lead to further violence.
It's not always a clean solution.
It highlights the importance of understanding those unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From historical examples to potential impacts and the legal complexities. But let's bring this into the present day for a moment.
Okay.
What about the 2007 National Defense Authorization Act?
Oh, okay.
Didn't that make some significant changes to the Insurrection Act?
It did.
Okay. What did it change?
Those changes were quite controversial because they expanded the president's authority to deploy troops domestically and broadened the definition of what constitutes an emergency.
So it basically made it easier for the president to send in the military.
That's how many critics saw it.
Okay.
It raised concerns about potential abuse of power, especially given the already broad powers under the Insurrection Act.
It's a stark reminder that the laws governing martial law are constantly evolving.
Absolutely.
And it's important to stay informed about these changes and how they could affect our rights and freedoms.
The legal landscape surrounding martial law is complex and often subject to political maneuvering.
Right.
It's crucial for citizens to understand these issues and engage in informed discussion about the role of the military in a democratic society.
So after all this talk about history and legal frameworks, what's the key takeaway here?
Okay.
Why should our listener care about this?
Right.
even if they don't think martial law is something they'll ever experience.
What's fascinating about martial law is that it forces us to confront fundamental questions about the balance between power and liberty.
Right.
You know, in a democracy, we expect certain rights and freedoms to be protected.
Right.
But what happens when those rights come into conflict with the need for security or order?
That's a question that's been debated for centuries.
Right.
And there's no easy answer.
Exactly. And martial law represents that extreme scenario where those questions become very real.
It's
it's
kind of a scary thought.
It's a reminder that the rule of law isn't something we can take for granted.
Yeah.
It's something we need to actively defend and understand because it's the foundation of a free and just society.
So it's not just about knowing the laws.
Right.
It's about being aware of the potential risks and engaging in those tough conversations.
Yeah.
About what kind of society we want to live in and how we balance those competing values in times of crisis.
Precisely. Because even if martial law never happens where you live, understanding its history, the legal frameworks and the potential consequences can empower us to make more informed choices about the kind of world we want to create and the values we want to uphold.
Yeah, it's incredible how these historical examples really drive home the point that martial law isn't just about hypothetical threats. It's about real-world power dynamics and how those can shift in times of crisis.
Absolutely. And, you know, one example that really exemplifies that is the case of Phoenix City, Alabama, back in 1954. It was known as the wickedest city in America. Because it was essentially run by organized crime.
Oh, wow.
The corruption and violence were so rampant that the governor eventually had to declare martial law.
Oh, wait, they used martial law to take down the mob?
They did.
That sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The National Guard stepped in, took over law enforcement duties, raided illegal gambling dens, and even went so far as invalidating existing weapons permits.
Yeah, so they really cracked down.
It was a pretty dramatic way to restore order when traditional law enforcement had completely broken down.
That's a pretty extreme example.
It is.
But it does raise the question.
Yeah.
If martial law can be used to target organized crime, couldn't it also be used to target other groups that those in power deem undesirable?
That's a very valid concern.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what we've been discussing throughout this deep dive. The potential for abuse is always present when you have such a concentration of power. That's why clear legal guidelines and strong oversight are absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
The Phoenix City case, while extreme, serves as a potent reminder that checks and balances are essential to prevent martial law from becoming a tool for political oppression.
So it seems like finding that balance between security and liberty is a constant challenge.
Absolutely.
Especially in times of crisis.
And as we've seen, the history of martial law in the U.S. is full of instances where that balance has been tested. It's a complex and often controversial topic.
Yeah. But one that deserves our attention and understanding.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of martial law, I'm left with a lot to think about. It's been fascinating to explore the historical context, the legal frameworks, and the potential impact on everyday life.
I agree. It's one of those topics that really forces you to grapple with some fundamental questions about power, freedom, and what it means to live in a democracy.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head with that point. Martial law isn't just about troops on the streets or curfews. It's about those big questions about what we value as a society.
Absolutely.
And how we navigate those values when faced with extraordinary circumstances.
It's a reminder that the rule of law is fragile. And that we all have a role to play in safeguarding our rights and freedoms.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought.
If you were in a situation where martial law was declared, what would your priority be? Personal survival? Upholding your rights? Or something else entirely? It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring those depths of knowledge.